Welcome to this week's Faith Connect video. This week I'm going to be doing the first of a two-part video series about my study time this last summer. So just as some background for you, every year Faith provides a week of continuing education or study time for pastors, and then every 3 years you can get an additional 6 weeks. And then there's a little bit of other time we've negotiated. And the focus of this is on study time to help me as a pastor be really well informed, up with things, and well prepared for ministry years. In the last couple years, we've also added a dynamic of spiritual renewal time that we really want church leaders, pastors, elders, deacons, really everybody to be well grounded spiritually, to be able to not just perform well, but perform out of a well of personal well-being and a good spiritual relationship. It's out of our relationship with the Lord that a lot of our ministry comes. So we have this goal with this time of studying and being in a good place headwise, but also being renewed and being in a good place in terms of the heart. So this video is going to be more focused on some of the actual study stuff that I did. The next video is going to be more focused on some spiritual renewal time that I was privileged to have over this summer. So I'm going to jump through 3 topics in this video that are going to come up in some different ways through sermon series and some different ministry things throughout this year. The first of those 3, and I'm going to move pretty fast. You may need to rewind a little bit, watch this a couple times if you really want all the details, but these are some different areas we're going to cover this year. The first one is what we're calling At Home in Exile. A lot of us grew up in a culture that felt pretty comfortable with our Christianity, that we felt like in general the odds were stacked for us, things just worked well. And more it seems like we're in a culture that's antagonistic to our faith, that creates friction, or where we're going against the flow, and we need to wrestle through how we approach that. In the last century or so, really, since a classic book called Christ in Culture, we've had some particular categories that most people work with in terms of how we relate to culture. And one option is Christ against culture, that we withdraw from culture, that we step back. Another is Christ of culture, that we assimilate to the culture. And then there's a third option of Christ transforming culture, that we're deeply grounded in our faith, but we bring that to the culture in ways that are hopefully positive all around. So I read a book by D.A. Carson called Christ and Culture Revisited, and in that book he wrestles through some of those categories, proposes some strategies for how we as Christians engage with the culture helpfully. His ultimate 2 main points in that book, I think, are that we need to really look to Jesus for wisdom, look to Jesus in terms of reading the Gospels and seeing how Jesus functioned, but also in terms of prayer and our spiritual lives, really focusing on Jesus. And then along with that, he says we really need to look to the whole storyline of Scripture. For the most part, we tend to pick the parts that we like, pick the approaches we like, and Carson says wisdom is to be found in reading the whole storyline of Scripture and seeing how that helps us understand our own moment and how to bring Christ into this moment. Another book that I read, much more practically focused, is called Faith for Exiles. It proposes 5 research-based ways for Christians to follow Jesus here and now, and what that book calls our current digital Babylon. So I won't list those 5 ways. You can Google the book if you're really interested, but some of those strategies will show up in our discussions over the coming year. In the show notes, there's going to be a link to an article, Christ in Culture in Light of the Gospel, that gives you a 3-page summary of some of those things. Elders and council are looking at it this month. If you want to read that, it's a really helpful intro into that topic. So that's one topic. The next topic we're going to wrestle with in a couple different ways this year is anxiety. And probably the title we're going to work with is Really Anxious and Real Peace. Anxiety is just such a massive concern these days, along with all kinds of mental health issues and concerns, and we wonder how to be healthy, and so many of us feel like we're just in a more fragmented and difficult place than we used to be. So we're going to address that this coming year. A couple books that I read in preparation for that. One is by Max Lucado called Anxious for Nothing. And Lucado's point is we spend a lot of energy being anxious and getting ourselves on hamster wheels and just running, and we aren't actually helping ourselves. And he's very gracious and very sympathetic to how hard it is to be healthy in these anxiety-ridden days. But he proposes some ways that we can slow down and maybe get to a better place. He calls us, and this is an acronym, CALM, C-A-L-M, to celebrate God's goodness, to ask for God's help, to leave our concerns with Him, and then to meditate on good things. So C-A-L-M. Again, you can Google the book, get a summary of it if you really want to, but that's a helpful book to acknowledge the real concerns we have and the real anxiety we're experiencing, but invite us into some specifically spiritual strategies for dealing with it. Another book that I read that's really been quite helpful is The Anxious Christian by Rhett Smith, and that's fairly biographical. He shares a fair amount of his own experience, his life troubles, his anxiety, and then asks the question, can God use even our anxiety, even our struggles, to be good for God's kingdom and good for us? So again, another helpful book that I read as part of that. For the third topic, and this is a bigger one that we'll probably approach from a number of angles, but alienation and belonging. On the particular book I want to highlight that I read is No Longer Strangers by Gregory Coles. Coles is a relatively young guy, I think he's in his 20s at this point, and he writes about his experience growing up as an Indonesian missionary kid, and then with some different health concerns he had there, never being able to go back to Indonesia. So now he's living in America. He can't ever go to what felt like home. And as he became a young adult and grew up, he realized that he was same-sex attracted. So he had all these questions about how he could live in relationship with people, what would and wouldn't work, and he settled on the gospel call to celibacy. But that's meant that a lot of types of things that many of us dream us or expect in terms of relationships simply are out of bounds for him. So in this book, he wrestles with his own experience. What does it mean to not belong in Indonesia and not belong in America as a missionary kid who's now grown up and trying to find his own way? And what does it mean to be a single celibate Christian without hope of marriage? And how does he belong? What does it mean in a life that could be so very alienated? What does it mean for him to belong to Jesus, belong to the Christian community? And he has some good reflections about how we as Christians can find ways to be a people where others belong because we belong to Christ together. I also read Every Body's Story by Branson Parler, who's a Reformed Church in America guy, and he wrestles with some similar issues of alienation, belonging, especially in terms of our life as embodied beings, as people who are created by God, body and soul. And what does that mean, especially in terms of our sexuality these days, when there are so many options on the table, so much disagreement, so much isolation and anger? How do we embody our lives? How do we be who God created us to be in a way that isn't just liberation to whatever we want or empty legalism, but really reflects God's covenant love for us? How do we live in relationship as who God made us to be, recognizing we live in a broken world? So those are some of the themes we're going to try to address this year. If you want to talk more about any of those, I'm happy to grab coffee and talk with you. But in some ways, the overarching theme for this year is how do we really belong to Jesus well? And how does that overflow into our Christian community and also into our connection with those around us? Again, next week we'll have another video focused a little bit more on the spiritual renewal time I had this summer. And if you've got any questions, feel free to get a hold of me. Thanks.